Happy Hollow Recreation Center began in 1911 after banker E.W. Clark purchased former quarry land and gave it to Philadelphia for neighborhood use. The city describes it as the oldest recreation center building still operating for its original purpose, and its name came from the hollow landscape and the happiness it was intended to bring children. That history is important because public recreation is infrastructure, not a side note. A gym, playground, garden, or after-school room can shape who gets to feel safe, skilled, and visible in a neighborhood. The route identifies this area with the 1967 race disturbances, but do not reduce the stop to a riot label. The larger story is how Germantown residents have repeatedly used public space to negotiate conflict, care for young people, and demand investment. Look at the building as a community archive. Its walls hold sports, classes, arguments, celebrations, and generations of adults returning to give back. City renovation documents describe upgrades for accessibility, safety, the roof, playground, spray ground, and community use. Those details show preservation as an active process. A historic building survives because people keep insisting it should serve the present. Ask what a neighborhood loses when recreation closes, and what becomes possible when the doors stay open. This is the right opening for an Old York Road route because corridors are measured not only by famous addresses but by the everyday places that let residents gather. From here, continue toward Germantown High School and listen for the connection between public recreation, public education, and the long struggle over who gets a fully supported civic life. You are at the former Germantown High School, a public institution established in 1914 and closed after its final class in 2013. The route calls it Philadelphia's first integrated high school, but that claim needs careful framing. Philadelphia's school history includes earlier mixed enrollment and neighborhood schools, while Germantown High's public record is better understood through the changing demographics, boundaries, and policies of Northwest Philadelphia. A University of Pennsylvania study of the school traces how residential segregation, economic change, and district decisions reshaped the campus over the 20th century. That is the story to hear here. Integration is not a single opening day event. It is an ongoing question about attendance, resources, transportation, neighborhood power, and whose children are expected to share opportunity. The school opened in 1914, grew to serve thousands of students, and later became part of a complicated grade arrangement when Martin Luther King High School opened nearby. It graduated its final class in 2013. Stand outside and imagine the layers: students moving between classrooms, athletes crossing the fields, teachers building expectations, families debating whether the school could deliver a future, and residents watching a major civic building become vacant. Compare this stop with Happy Hollow. One is designed for play and community recreation, the other organizes adolescents around credentials, discipline, and public possibility. Both reveal how a city invests in young people. Avoid presenting the building as a monument to decline. The school's alumni, teachers, teams, and classrooms are the history. Ask what the neighborhood remembers that official timelines leave out, and what a new use would need to honor. Then continue toward the Nile, where the route shifts from public education to Black political culture, food, and self-determined economic life. At the Nile, the route turns to food as politics, memory, and community care. Public sources describe the Nile Cafe as part of Philadelphia's early modern vegan scene, before the city became nationally known for meat-free restaurants. The route identifies this Germantown address with vegan soul food and Black Panther organizing. Because ownership and founding details are not consistently documented in the sources available here, treat that claim as a local oral history lead to verify with the restaurant's own records, interviews, or neighborhood archives. The broader history is clear enough to interpret. Soul food is often discussed as comfort, but it is also a record of adaptation, people making nourishing meals from constrained resources, transforming regional ingredients, and carrying memory through taste. Vegan soul food adds another layer, connecting Black culinary tradition with health, animal ethics, religious practice, and political self-determination. A restaurant can be a meeting place, a workplace, a cultural classroom, and a form of independent infrastructure. Look at the storefront and surrounding corridor. Ask who gets to decide what a neighborhood should eat, what counts as healthy, and which businesses receive the support needed to survive. The Black Panther movement's community programs are relevant here as a framework. Political organizations often built credibility through practical services, not slogans alone. Food programs, health education, and mutual aid made political commitments tangible. Do not invent a direct institutional connection unless the local record confirms it. Instead, use this stop to hear how food and organizing can overlap. After the school stop, this restaurant brings the route back to the body, nourishment, gathering, and conversation. From here, continue to the Johnson House, where food and mutual aid open into the documented history of abolition, freedom seekers, and the Underground Railroad. The Johnson House is one of Philadelphia's strongest documented Underground Railroad sites. Built in the 18th century and associated with the abolitionist Johnson family, it became a place where freedom seekers could receive shelter, food, and assistance while moving towards safety. The historic site emphasizes the work of both black and white abolitionists and the importance of local networks rather than a single heroic conductor. That distinction matters. The Underground Railroad was not a literal railroad and rarely operated as one centrally controlled system. It was a changing web of people, homes, churches, farms, businesses, and routes, with enormous danger attached to every decision. The house's location on Germantown Avenue helps us imagine how a road can be both ordinary and strategic. Movement through a familiar neighborhood could provide cover, but it could also expose a person to surveillance, informants, slave catchers, and legal violence. As you stand here, keep the focus on the freedom seekers themselves. They were not passive passengers in somebody else's story. They made decisions, took risks, and carried knowledge about routes, people, and timing. The Johnson family and other allies could provide aid, but the system depended on courage from those pursuing freedom. The site also forces a difficult question about memory. How do we honor abolition without turning the past into a comforting story in which Philadelphia was simply on the right side? Northern cities profited from slavery and contained their own racism even while some residents opposed the fugitive slave system. Read the house as a place of action inside contradiction. Compare its domestic scale with the school and recreation center. Freedom work happened in rooms, kitchens, yards, and conversations. From here, continue to Clifton, where Revolutionary battle history and the lives of enslaved people occupy the same landscape. Clifton is a Georgian mansion completed in 1767 for Benjamin Chew, a prominent Philadelphia lawyer and judge. On October 4, 1777, the Battle of Germantown reached this property during the Revolutionary War. The house still bears evidence of the fighting, including damage associated with musket and cannon fire. But the battle is only one layer. Clifton's interpretation also addresses the people who were enslaved by the Chew family and whose labor sustained the household and estate. That combination is essential. A historic house can preserve elite architecture and military memory while also requiring visitors to ask who cooked, cleaned, carried, planted, repaired, and endured coercion. The route describes enslaved Africans' contributions, but the word contributions must not soften the reality of slavery. Labor performed under ownership was extracted through force and denied freedom. Walk the grounds with both timelines in view. The 1777 battle was a dramatic event, but daily life on the property was longer and more repetitive: meals, maintenance, family separation, supervision, and resistance. Clifton's current interpretation is valuable partly because it refuses to let the mansion's polished rooms speak alone. Compare this site with the Johnson House. At Johnson House, the central story is organized around abolition and freedom seeking. At Clifton, the same region reveals the legal, economic, and domestic structures that made slavery part of Philadelphia's history. Neither site should be reduced to a single moral label. Together they show that freedom and unfreedom existed in the same landscape. Before leaving, note the relationship between the mansion, road, gardens, and outbuildings. Historic landscapes are systems, not backdrops. Then continue to the Ogontz Theatre site, where the route moves into 20th century black performance and the cultural life of a segregated city. The Ogontz Theatre was a neighborhood theater built in 1909, later associated with the changing entertainment culture of North Philadelphia. Philly history describes it as one of Philadelphia's beautiful neighborhood theaters, with a large auditorium and a history connected to the era of inexpensive films and popular performance. The route frames the site as a vaudeville palace for black artists during segregation. Because the building's programming history deserves archival verification, hold that phrase as a route interpretation rather than an absolute claim about every act that appeared here. The larger context is well documented. Segregated entertainment systems limited where black audiences could sit and where black performers could work, while black theaters and touring circuits created their own cultural economies. A theater was not just a screen or stage. It was a public interior where style, music, comedy, news, romance, and political feeling gathered. Look at the block and imagine the infrastructure that has disappeared: posters, ticket windows, ushers, streetcars, evening crowds, restaurants, and shops that benefited from showtime traffic. When a theater closes, the building may vanish, but the neighborhood's memory of anticipation remains. Compare this site with the Johnson House and Cliveden. Those places are often taught through solemn history. The theater reminds us that black life also included pleasure, glamour, laughter, and professional ambition. Cultural spaces were forms of survival. They offered artists work and audiences a world larger than the restrictions imposed outside. Ask what it means for a city to lose a performance venue, and whose history becomes harder to see when the marquee disappears. Then turn back toward the route's anchor at Old York Road and North Broad, where the road itself becomes the subject. At Old York Road and North Broad, read the intersection as a transportation archive. Old York Road developed from an older route linking Philadelphia with points north, and the city's historical documents describe Germantown's roads as changing from Indian paths to colonial roads and then major urban arteries. The route identifies free black laborers as builders of milestones, a claim that should be tied to a specific marker or archival record when presented on site. Even without that detail, the central idea is powerful: roads are built by labor that maps often hide. A corridor gathers movement, commerce, migration, schooling, worship, protest, and memory over time. It can connect neighborhoods while also exposing unequal access to land, transit, safety, and investment. Look at the width of the streets, the crossings, storefronts, bus stops, and vacant edges. Ask what the intersection tells you about who is expected to move quickly, who waits, and who can afford to stop. This is why the route should not be treated as a string of isolated landmarks. Happy Hollow, Germantown High, the Nile, Johnson House, Cliveden, and the Ogontz Theatre all depend on the corridor's ability to carry people. Old York Road is therefore not just a name from the past. It is a living system whose meaning changes as residents, businesses, institutions, and transportation patterns change. Use the intersection to orient yourself geographically, then move north toward the Cecil B. Moore Law Office. The next stop makes leadership locatable by placing black legal advocacy and civil rights organizing at a particular address. This stop is associated with Cecil B. Moore, the Philadelphia lawyer, labor organizer, and civil rights leader whose public career linked courtroom work with direct action. Moore studied law at Temple, represented clients, challenged discrimination, and became president of the Philadelphia NAACP. He was known for confrontational organizing, including campaigns against segregated workplaces, housing practices, and institutions that excluded black Philadelphians. The route identifies this address as his law office. Verify the surviving building and exact period of occupancy with local preservation records, but keep the historical point: an office can be political infrastructure. It is where cases are prepared, witnesses are heard, strategy is debated, and personal injury is translated into public claims. Moore's activism also reminds us that civil rights history was not only national speeches and famous court decisions. It was neighborhood work, pickets, negotiations, press conferences, phone calls, fundraising, and the persistence to return after officials said no. Stand here and imagine the difference between a law office as a private business and a law office as a community command post. Who could enter? Who brought a problem? Which institutions could be pressured, and which could ignore a complaint? Connect more to the route's other stops. Happy Hollow represents public care, Germantown High represents contested educational opportunity, the Johnson House represents abolitionist networks, and the theatre represents cultural self-determination. Moore's office adds legal strategy and organized protest. Together they show that a corridor's history is made through multiple forms of power, service, learning, memory, art, and law. Do not turn Moore into a flawless symbol. The value of the site is that leadership was practical and sometimes abrasive because the barriers were real. From here, continue to Relish Restaurant, where the route explores how a historic building can hold contemporary Black hospitality and cuisine. Relish Restaurant is the route's food and preservation stop, identified as upscale soul food in a historic mansion on Ogontz Avenue. The building's earlier life should be confirmed through its architectural record and the restaurant's own history, but the pairing itself invites a useful question: what happens when a historic domestic structure becomes a public dining room? A mansion suggests private wealth, hierarchy, and inherited space. A restaurant turns that space outward, asking strangers to share it through service, menu, and occasion. Soul food carries its own complicated history. It can express family, creativity, survival, and regional identity, while also being stereotyped or treated as a museum of poverty rather than a living cuisine. Upscale presentation does not erase those roots, it can be an act of authorship, showing that Black chefs and diners define the terms of refinement for themselves. Look at the relationship between facade, entrance, dining room, and street. Hospitality depends on invisible labor, cooks, servers, cleaners, managers, growers, and suppliers. That makes this stop a companion to Happy Hollow and the Nile. All three ask us to think about care, but through different institutions: recreation, community food, and formal dining. The restaurant also gives the route a present-tense ending before Woodmere. History is not only behind glass. It is in the menu decisions, the staffing, the guests, and the choice to make a historic building useful now. Ask what should be preserved when a place changes use: the exterior, the room plan, the stories of earlier residents, the workers' memories, or all of those together. Then travel to Woodmere Art Museum, where the corridor's final stop turns those questions toward Black artists and the institutions that made their work visible. Woodmere Art Museum closes this route with We Speak, Black Artists in Philadelphia, an exhibition covering Black artists working from the 1920s through the 1970s. Woodmere's curatorial record describes more than 70 paintings, photographs, sculptures, and prints, along with 14 oral history interviews involving artists, families, dealers, museum leaders, and scholars. The exhibition's importance is not just the number of works. It shows that Philadelphia's Black art history was built through overlapping networks: public schools, settlement houses, the WPA, galleries, universities, the Brandywine Workshop, the Eel Ife Black Humanitarian Center, the Pyramid Club, and museums. Artists including Meta Vaux, Warwick Fuller, Dox Thrash, Barbara Bullock, Alan Freelon, Henry Ossawa Tanner, Raymond Saunders, and many others make it impossible to tell the city's art story as a single linear canon. Look at the museum as an institution that selects, preserves, frames, and explains. Ask whose work was collected during the artist's lifetime, who had access to galleries and critics, and what oral history adds that a label cannot. The exhibition's title, We Speak, emphasizes voice and agency. Black artists are not merely subjects represented by others, they are makers who shaped Philadelphia's visual language and its public imagination. This final stop also loops back to the corridor. Art depends on movement between neighborhoods, schools, studios, restaurants, churches, clubs, and museums. The road carried people and ideas, while institutions decided which memories became visible. End by naming the route's full arc: public recreation, contested education, food and organizing, abolition, slavery and battle, Black performance, transportation, civil rights, hospitality, and art. The advertised route takes far longer than this compressed video because real travel, access, conversation, and time inside each site matter. This narration is an orientation, not a substitute for being there.